so much for being here. Welcome to yet another installation of our virtual history series that is offered by the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. My name is Irene Moore Davis, and I am so happy to welcome you here today. Before we get started, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. We are hosting this virtual history presentation from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And here in Essex County, we also recognize the longstanding presence of Huron-Wendat peoples. And we are so grateful to be here on these lands, sharing these lands and these resources with the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. We recognize that it is our role and our responsibility to remain in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples and to cooperate in caring for the land, the water, all living creatures, and one another. We are so pleased to have Marie Carter hosting us, joining us today. And if you have been involved at all in Southwestern Ontario Black historical research, I'm sure that you're familiar with Marie Carter's name, if not Marie Carter's face. She's been operating in this space for a very long time. Marie Carter is a lifelong resident of Dresden, Ontario, where she researches and writes about the history of her community, which was part of the former Don settlement area. Marie is a past member of the Uncle Tom's Cabin Community Advisory Board, now of course known as the Josiah Henson Museum of African Canadian History. And she was a co-investigator on the 5-year Community University Research Alliance, the Promised Land Project. In the Light of Dawn represents the culmination of a lifetime of questions and over 20 years of serious research that began with the discovery of a group of previously unknown Black land investors and developers in Dresden from the 1850s to the 1880s during the Trillium Trail Historical Walk Project. That discovery suggested that there was much more to the Don settlement story than just the story of Reverend Josiah Henson, even though Josiah Henson is obviously very important. Marie has spoken extensively about her findings in the former Don settlement at area schools and museums and has been featured in the Ontario Heritage Trust 7-part YouTube series, Discovering Don, which highlights artifact buildings in Dresden associated with the Don settlement's history. Her early findings were published in the anthology, The Promised Land, History and Historiography of the Chatham-Kent Black Settlements and Beyond from University of Toronto Press, and in the locally published Stepping Back in Time Along Dresden's Trillium Trail, as well as being featured on the trail's signage. Marie Carter's latest book, about which we are all very excited, is In the Light of Dawn, The History and Legacy of a Black Canadian Community, that has come forward from University of Regina Press just this year. And it is the first in the new Henry and Mary Bibb series of Black studies instituted by the incredible Dr. Afua Cooper. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Marie Carter, and just noting that we will pause for questions at the end. Thank you, Marie. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Irene. I'm so glad you invited me to here today, and to people who are Rosalind watching now and people who will watch this in the future. I'm very pleased to be able to have this opportunity to talk to you about In the Light of Dawn, not just because that's, of course, good for me to be able to promote the book and the ideas, but also because it's a learning opportunity for me as well to learn from you. I really do see in the histories how connected the various communities were. And it's not surprising that a lot of the figures from Essex County appear at dawn and vice versa. And I thought that would be a good place to start the presentation, to talk about some of that connectivity, because I think that's important. And I also think that it's a good lead into some of the themes of this book, particularly through a little reading that I want to do for you from, it's from the book, and it's on chapter 9, and it's called And Still They Come. And it starts, not surprisingly, with Henry Bibb. And I know you're all very familiar with Henry Bibb because he was, and his wife Mary, were the publishers of the Voice of the Fugitive. And also that he was very involved with Reverend Henson in the establishment of the Refugee Home Society. So, some huge connections there. After I do the reading, then I want to go into just kind of broad strokes about some of the other figures that we hold in common between our two areas, and then I'll get more into the kind of the general what the book covers in its 200-year continuum that it looks at. So to start with, I'm going to connect my slideshow for you. Just one second. Oh, goodness. I'm sorry, Irene.
There, you've got it. Excellent.
Yay. I apologize. I'm not used to using this format.
You're doing great.
Okay, so I've just put up one of the direct quotes from Henry Bibb that you'll hear appearing in this reading, just so you know that these are his words. The main season of migration had just begun along the Underground Railroad's busiest crossing into Canada at Windsor. Henry Bibb tallied the numbers for a report he planned to run in the Voice of the Fugitive newspaper. Bibb was encouraged by what he saw. Prior to 1850, an estimated 5,600 people had migrated north to Canada, a number of them on the Underground Railroad. Between then and the time of Bibb's report, the numbers had increased dramatically, and thousands more were now crossing the border into Canada west over the decade leading up to the Civil War. What excited Bibb most was not the 3 fugitives a day he noted, but rather the large number of free colored people arriving from Pennsylvania, Maryland, the District of Columbia, Ohio, and Indiana. Bibb noted that 10 passed by Windsor to Chatham in the 7th instance and 20 on the 8th, and the cry is, "Still they come." It was not just their sheer numbers that excited Bibb, but the potential that advantaged freemen represented. Bibb himself, formerly enslaved, was gratified to see free people casting their lot with their fugitive brethren here in Canada. Their presence, he believed, was needed to lend a hand to advance our interest and position in Canada, something they were uniquely positioned to do because of their opportunities, as Bibb said, for literary and pecuniary advantages that our more unfortunate brethren have not. As such, Bibb understood that this was not just a migration of people, but of resources and ideas. And I think that's a really nice way also to connect one of the main kind of themes that is in the book, and that is the really the remarkable diversity of the migration that took place, and that will be a kind of a major part of this talk as well. But I do want to talk a little bit about these figures that do intersect between the two areas. And I think that goes right back and beyond the time of Henry Bibb and Reverend Josiah Henson, back into the time of the fur trade, which is featured in the early part of the book, where we talk about the connection of this area to the fur trading hub in Detroit. And when we're looking at that time period, you see all kinds of common figures traveling through a very wide area from Pennsylvania up to this area, but also with this kind of stopover in Detroit. And those included people like Butler's Rangers, who you're surely very familiar with down in Amherstburg, Sally Ains, the indigenous fur trader, who owned a lot of land and also slaves at Chatham, but who is part of that fur trading network. The United Empire Loyalists and their enslaved servants, but also the black soldiers that came here. Mary Ann Shadd, of course, shows up in Windsor, along with, surprisingly, Reverend John Scobell, who was a rather controversial figure in terms of education of Blacks in southwestern Ontario. And, of course, people like the Reverend Hiram Wilson, who is a major figure at dawn, also was operating in the Essex County area as part of his Canada mission, and he was closely aligned with the man who ran the Rice mission in your area as well. And as we come further forward, we also see that in the Refugee Home Society, it's not just Henson that comes from the Don area to support Bibb's work in that area, but a man by the name of George Carey. And Carey, he's a trustee on the board of the British American Institute, but he's also a former freeman from Toronto who had quite a number of business interests there. And not surprisingly, the Carey name, he is also the brother-in-law of Mary Ann Shadd Carey. So those are just a few, just to kind of illustrate, just how much connection there is between our communities. And I hope in the course of reading the book that it provides you with some maybe tidbits of information about some of these characters or their connection to your area that you didn't have before. Because I think in understanding the relationship between our various communities, there's so much more that we can discover. For me, this whole story, even though it's this international, even transatlantic, transcontinental kind of story that is set against this backdrop of some of the major historical events and includes a lot of the major historical figures that are traveling over long distances. For me, this has been a very personal journey that really began next door. And this is when I was a child, this is what Uncle Tom's Cabin Museum looked like. That actually is on the left-hand side. That house was actually at one time attached to the part that is now Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was an addition onto it at some point. And it was pulled away from the main building by the man who was living in the other piece, which is Bill Chappell. And Bill Chappell was our nearest neighbor on the third concession when I was growing up. And every day when we went when we were traveling into town along the third concession to the River Road, we'd pass by this and other sites that were very much connected to the story of Josiah Henson and the Underground Railroad. But of course, when I was about 6 years old and just discovering that, I had no idea what any of this meant. I didn't even know what a museum was, and I would bug my parents every time we went by. I would ask, who's Mr. Chappell's Uncle Tom, and why does he have a museum? It didn't make any sense to me. And when I went by this site further down, which this is a very early image, the way it would have looked again as when I was a child, of what Josiah Henson's grave was. And at that time, it was independent of the museum. It was further down the road. And I would read this and see the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe in the same size letters as Reverend Josiah Henson and think, oh, was Harriet also buried here? Like, what is the relationship here? What is the connection? And you can imagine my poor mom, answering all these whys all the time. And one day, I think she just got a little frustrated with all that, and she pressed the quarter price of admission in my hand and sent me next door to go ask Mr. Chappell for myself. And I began to learn about this man. And I'm sure that, I'm sure that the narrative that I learned back in those days is probably the narrative that most of us were exposed to over most of the 20th century, where we talked about Reverend Henson as Father Henson, the man who had escaped slavery in the U.S. South. Had come along the Underground Railroad and founded a settlement called Don, which had a manual labor school to educate former slaves. And I think one of the unfortunate pieces of that narrative was that Don was always portrayed as a failure. And I think that's a common theme with a lot of the early Black settlements in southwestern Ontario. We hear that label of failure attached to places like Lucan and Refugee Home Society and others. And I think it's a real disservice because, as you'll see in the arguments in the book and some of the work that other scholars are doing, that these places were not failures. And the main evidence of that is the people who remained here into my time, certainly. Anyhow, because it was labeled a failure, of course, the main reasons we are told that Henson's story matters is because he was the inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe's main character in the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that he had gotten to meet the Queen. And in this kind of really truncated version of Henson's life really has not served us well in getting at what Dawn really was about. And all credit to Reverend Henson, who is a remarkable historical figure, but his whole legacy has labored under this Uncle Tom label for a great deal of time. And unfortunately, the landmark anti-slavery novel that was Harriet Beecher Stowe's was not copyrighted, and subsequently in the minstrel shows and other adaptations, it really did denigrate this whole term of Uncle Tom, and it's something that the Henson legacy has labored under. It's also not just the Tom plays, but some of the images that were created around that time because of the runaway kind of popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin, there was a demand for these cabin images. And so there were photographers who cashed in on this and created these types of images, which almost universally show Black settlers as poor and poor and lowly. And that's actually the subtitle of Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, is Life Among the Poor and Lowly. So you can see where images like this are quite powerful and in creating historical stereotypes. And in fact, we know in the case of this photograph, this was actually taken in the Dawn settlement area in about the 1870s or 80s by a young woman who was trying to make her name for herself as a professional photographer. And it's the only image within a portfolio that universally portrays very prosperous white settlements. And this is the only portrayal of a Black family. So you can see where this is likely a staged image. I've had different people look at this who tell me that it is probably more a cattle shed than it is a residence. And so you see how some of these historical stereotypes or would have been distorted the perception of Black settlers as well. There is actually, this image is actually is literally a historical stereotype. The word stereotype actually originally applied to these images that were created for the press. A stereotype is an image that's used over and over and over again to present a general idea, but it never really portrays an actual person or event. And stereotypes are useful in their way, but are not good for presenting the whole of the truth. Unfortunately, with stereotype images like this, which are the equivalent stock images that we have now today in photographs, they are used so often, even in the 20th century, to promote ideas like the Underground Railroad. I know that Uncle Tom's Cabin Museum under Jack Thompson for a time used this image as in all its promotional literature. So I think unconsciously we begin to absorb images like this and believe that they are a short form for ideas like the Underground Railroad, and they begin to shape how we think about the people that were involved. Stories are powerful too, and we need to be careful with the stories we tell and the images we use in order to ensure that we have an accurate representation of the peoples that we are trying to portray. For me, understanding that there was more to the story than the traditional narrative I've been told by Mr. Chappell and others was it all really began for me with an accidental discovery in Dresden in 2001 during something called the Trillium Trail Historical Walk. That was a 20 station kind of historical walk that went through the floodplain in Dresden. And when the sponsoring bodies wanted my husband and I to create these plaques on the walking trail and an accompanying book, they asked that we go to the primary records, and I'll be forever grateful for them having that commitment to knowing the real bedrock kind of research that needed to be done to find the real truth of what was happening along that trail area, because it surfaced this man. And this was the huge surprise of the project, was that about 3/4 of the town site of Dresden had been owned by this man and also by other people that were his family and colleagues. All those individuals were involved with the William Still Underground Railway network and had also bought up all this land at Dresden and had created businesses, infrastructure, brought in professional services, all kinds of things that a community needs in order to support the population. And this is William Whipper, who is the, this is William Whipper, who is the one of the primary figures in the William Still Underground Railroad network, and he smuggled hundreds of people north to Canada, which he called the Land of Freedom. And unfortunately, when he referred to the Dawn settlement area, he referred to it by its correct name, and he called it his lands along the Sydenham. And so, even though his history is very out there, it's very visible in the William Still History of the Underground Railroad, and you can read about him in that 1871 publication, that people did not tend to connect the dots between his lands along the Sydenham, what that meant, and that it meant that he had this land in the heart of the Dawn settlement. In addition to Whipper, who was from Pennsylvania and a freeman, there were other freemen from Pennsylvania and Virginia, most notably the Charity family. And a lot of the work that was done for the book and for previous writing that I've done was in mapping the properties that these men had. And it was absolutely amazing how much that they did own and how much economic activity that they had spurred at Dresden. So you can see for me that the discovery of Whipper was turning my world upside down, because on one hand, like on the left-hand side, these were the images that I grew up with. But as I explored Whipper and his family, on the other hand, this is the young lady who is William Whipper's niece. And the contrast of these images told me that there was very much more to the story that hadn't been told, and one that was a story of diversity, both with social, cultural, economic, and even racial diversity, educationally diverse backgrounds. And all these things to me spoke to an agency and effectiveness and a self-determination in respect to the Underground Railroad, but also in respect to community and social development that I had not heard before. The collective research revealed that the people I had been encouraged to think of as a homogenous culture and racial group with origins that were exclusively from the plantations of the southern U.S. states had in fact amazing diversity and travel trajectories whose origins could also be traced from lives of freedom in the northern U.S. states like Pennsylvania, but even more remarkably from England, South America, Haiti, and in at least one case, Malaysia. The greater range of life experiences, cultural influences, and economic and social standing, education, and political experience that their lives suggested meant this population possessed a far greater agency than traditional slavery to freedom narratives implied, and that they had contributed not only to abolitionism and to moral reform movements that introduced universal education, equality, and women's rights, but the evidence also showed that they played major roles in shaping the community of Dresden and other communities, and the Canadian society. And I think in all that, what really surprised me a great deal was the role of women and how much that had been left out of the story. And finding out about Dawn's women revealed connections that a couple of ladies by the name of Mary Ann Whipper and Julia Shadd had to the abolitionist movement in Pennsylvania, where they had been encouraged to step outside of the traditional Victorian women's role of home and family to become politically active in these movements. And these two women in particular were involved with Lucretia Mott, and I think that's a very familiar name to a lot of people, as Lucretia Mott and her early efforts for universal suffrage would have been in the background of these women who settled at Dresden. And their attitudes and worldviews, I would find, as we move through this continuum I'm going to talk about of contribution and resistance, that they also became influential on other generations. And it seems to me that there is no coincidence at all here that we have Julia and Marianne in one generation, and in the next generation, we see very self-determined young women like Reverend Jenny Johnson, who pursued a career as the first ordained woman minister in Canada, and she too had roots in Dresden and eventually in Chatham Township before she moved to Flint. And it was not just the women that were beneficiaries of a rich legacy left behind by the first Black pioneers. There appeared time and time again evidence of a continuum of contribution and resistance that had its roots in the pioneer period and ran like a golden thread through the successive generations, particularly in regard to the battle for civil rights. But more on that later. What I also discovered about settler families was that they had diverse sets of skills and quite rich cultural lives, in contrast to the notion that they had been universally illiterate former slaves who were unskilled or lacking culture and society. The evidence from newspaper accounts, family sources, and more revealed individuals who were bilingual or even multilingual because of roots in Haiti or because of their interactions with indigenous peoples. Some were skilled musicians like the Campbell family, that's pictured here. Writers and even newspaper publishers like William Howard Day and Josephus O'Banion, and professional people like doctors Amos Array and Tisdale Taylor. Some were real estate agents and entrepreneurs like J.B. Hollingsworth and J.W. Purnell, and intellectuals like Parker T. Smith, who was a member of the Benneker Institute. Black business people were also money lenders, and some of Dresden's early white businessmen got a hand up from Black businessmen or organizations like the Wilberforce Institute that provided them with loans and mortgages. And that's really flipping the whole scenario of who are the town founders on its head, I think. And I think that's a very important discovery to have made, that there was this economic relationship that was very different from what we've seen and portrayed in the past. And because there was the movement of ideas and people and money to this area from through the freemen to this area from Pennsylvania and Virginia, we began to see a lot of very important people who followed that movement north and began to begin to have this dialogue from their home areas in the United States with those that were still here in Canada. And we see impressive visitors like the celebrated orator, newspaperman, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who spoke at the Emancipation Day picnic at dawn in 1853. But he's just one of many leading figures in the 19th century struggle for emancipation and civil rights. And a whole lot of other leading figures of the period show it up at Dresden and other communities like your own here in southwestern Ontario. And among the people that you see here, starting up at the left, is Lucretia Mott. It's William Howard Day, Levi Coffin, Marianne Shadd Carey, Benjamin Drew, and Osborne Perry Anderson, who actually was a farmer at Dresden before he moved to Chatham as Marianne Shadd Carey's printer. And of course, John Brown, and then John Brown Jr. And it's an interesting range where we see John Brown coming to this area to recruit people for the Harper's Ferry raid, but also his son, John Brown Jr., who established Black colonies who recruited people for the establishment of Black colonies in Haiti. And of course, Marianne Shadd Carey was involved in the area in the recruitment of Civil War soldiers. There are many more as well that you can read about in the book who had this connection. But what happened to all that? And this was one of the major questions that struck me, that if the Don settlement really hadn't been a failure, if it had been a much more complex community than it was, what happened to the people? What happened to the ideas? And I think that for me, one of the interesting possibilities in that was that those ideas and that spirit that was there with the early settlers didn't die out. It continued on through the various generations. And I think the most startling example of that is the whole quest for civil rights. Because in 1850, there was one of the colleagues of William Whipper. His name was Dennis Hill, and he began the first challenge of segregation in common schools at Dresden in 1850. And then 100 years later, in 1954, you see the National Unity Association that was involved in the passage of the Fair Trades and Accommodations Practices Act that ended segregation in private businesses throughout Ontario. And that, incidentally, I was surprised when I put that on the timeline of civil rights took place before Viola Desmond's celebrated case in Nova Scotia and well before the case of the Montgomery bus boycott in the US. So it's quite a proud history, and I think it's unfortunate we don't know more about it, and that it's not put into context like this to say, where did this come from? Why Dresden? Why not Toronto or somewhere where organization of this kind of pushback against laws and conventions that were Canada-wide? Why would they happen at Dresden and not elsewhere? And I think this is maybe one of the contributing factors, is this heritage that's here. Of course, it's not only a continuum of resistance, but one of contribution that goes through the generations. And I've tried to find some good examples in the book of how the spirit moved through a lot of other kinds of areas of society. And one of the other more striking ones was in terms of military service. And this is a photograph from the Carter collection, Carter Henson collection. And it shows World War I soldiers who were involved in recreational activity, but we think that these are men of the 2nd Construction Battalion. And one of them is reportedly a Henson, but we were not able to identify the men in the photograph, and we're still looking for help with that if anybody has any idea who these gentlemen are. Don's people fought in the American Civil War and in successive generations, continuing to sacrificially serve their nation during World War I and during World War II, even when they were told they were not wanted. There are also many examples of contributions in fields of commerce, politics, entertainment, and the shaping of more authentic Black history, which is evidenced right into the present day through the renaming of Uncle Tom's Cabin as Josiah Henson Museum. And of course, Don's heritage and legacy continued to attract national and international figures to the present day. And these are just a few of the politicians and figures that have come to visit the former Don settlements area at Dresden. And of course, that's John Diefenbaker, Louis St. Laurent. Lester Pearson was also here. Lincoln Alexander. That's Dennis Hill. And we also have Barb Carter posing with Rosa Parks, who was here twice. And Stuart McLean came here to write a chapter on the National Unity Association and other aspects of Dresden's history in the late 1990s. I think this is a compelling story. I've only been able to give you in really broad strokes here, and I do welcome your questions after. And I hope that in reading the book that some of this becomes more evident with various examples that are there of some of the things I'm talking about. I hope it gives you just a glimpse of that compelling 200-year history that I've attempted to sketch out, and gives you this notion too, that this is just kind of a beginning, a sketching out of this story. I really do believe that there's much more to be told, much more to be discovered, and particularly in looking at Black settlement, Black pioneers, and their descendants over a broader area than just the Don settlement area. And I hope that future researchers will find some areas of the book that they would be excited to expand on. I believe that this is a history that's very important for all Canadians because it helps to better define our collective identity as a nation and supports our journey to becoming a more truly multicultural society, which was one that understands and values all of its people's heritage and contributions. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for the really interesting presentation, Marie. I'm going to invite members of our audience to raise their hands to be recognized if they would like to ask a question, but I'll ask the first one. What was the most surprising fact that you discovered as you were engaging in this research?
Oh my. There is so much. It's so rich that I think there were surprises at every turn. I think it's unfortunate that I think I spent, 3/4 of my life with this, what my friend called the turkey wing of the Christmas feast instead of the whole feast. We were robbed of so much amazing heritage, that's in this area, and I've always really felt for people who have felt left out of their own story as a result, you know, and I think the biggest surprise for me was probably how it flipped my own worldview upside down and how challenging that was for me in the beginning. And then to and I was always surprised too by the generosity of friends and neighbors and that I knew who were willing to share family photo albums, genealogical information, stories. That's a real gift. And I know that's not always easy for people. We're talking about families, and I've tried to be very respectful of the great gift that is. In terms of the history itself, I think Whipper was the first huge surprise, of course, but this connectivity, this continuity from generation to generation was a huge surprise too. It really finally answered the whys and really helped me understand, my own community much better.
You talked a little bit before we began, Marie, about sort of the reaction of local members of the Black community in and around Dresden to this book finally being available and finally having these stories shared. Can you share with our audience a little bit about the reactions and why people have described this book as so important to them?
Mm. I had a couple of families who approached me. One very early on in the research, when I first did the first paper on Whipper, actually, I had a woman come to me in tears, and she said, "Thank you very much for saying we were not all slaves." She said, "I've been trying to tell my family this for years, and they wouldn't believe me." And he said to finally see that somebody else is corroborating these family histories that say, yes, there was this diversity. Yes, they were not all people who had to follow a North Star. Some of them had very intimate information about geography, that were very skilled and knew how to travel across a continent. They didn't need a North Star. So these new stories help to really, reinforce and build her up and give her credibility in her children's eyes for these stories. And they started to listen more, which was interesting, really interesting. And I've had other people who, you can see the pride. You can just absolutely see people grow when they say, yes, this is the story, that is my story, that I can relate to, that talks about people who are in my family, that's family stories that I know, that this is us. And it's really wonderful to be able to do that with this work. Excuse me.
What has it meant to you, Marie, to have this book published by the University of Regina Press as part of Afua Cooper's new Henry and Mary Bibb Black History series?
Oh, first of all, very humbling. I'm very grateful to Afua for believing in the work. We met first back in the Promised Land project, and she edited one of the papers that I submitted, and liked the work. And when I contacted her just to ask her for her opinion on whether I should keep going and writing the draft that I was working on, and she just said, send it into my publishers. That was just floored me. of course, it was like a 3-year journey after that before the book actually was printed through peer review and edits and everything else. But I really hope the book does her series proud. I feel a great responsibility to Afua and to the series. Yeah, so it's a wonderful privilege.
Okay, I see Rosalind has a question.
Hi, Rosalind. I see your hand up. But I think your microphone's off. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Marie, I am so looking forward to reading your book. How can I get this?
There's lots of different ways. I believe that Irene is going to have them available at her museum, and they are also already available at the Josiah Henson Museum in Dresden, or you can order it online at University Regina Press, or through Amazon, or through Indigo, or Shelf 49. So there's lots of different ways. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I'll be able to get a copy. And just as a reminder, I met you so many years ago at North Buxton, and I'm a descendant of William Henry Bradley. And you took me inside the library there and showed me a copy of a picture of the land that he owned. And you recently sent a picture of his house, the remainders of his house,
Yes.
that was in a newspaper,
It
and
was demolished in the
sent that
70s.
to me. So thank you so much. I just appreciate your research and the dedication to this.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, and we're certainly seeing some positive comments in the chat. So thank you to those who have commented so beautifully. I have a question for you that's a little bit off script, but it's certainly become evident that a number of Black families in the latter portion of the 19th century or very early 20th century departed from Dresden and made their way specifically to places like Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor, Whitaker, Michigan, that section of southeastern Michigan. What can you tell us, if anything, about that movement and what might have propelled or compelled those families to make that transition?
I was fascinated by that actually because it really mirrors the Great Migration in the United States, that kind of flipping of populations where you go from poor rural areas into industrialized northern U.S. cities. And I wasn't able to kind of tease out completely. I think it would take a far better sociologist than I to sort through all that and understand how much of it is part of a more general migration from rural areas into cities that's happened over the course of the concentration of agriculture into fewer and fewer hands and the industrialization of agriculture. Because you're talking about communities like Dawn, the philosophy back in the 19th century was to own land was very important to your freedom. And so you had a lot of people who started out as rural on farms, as farmers, and you're starting in a time period when over 50% of people lived on farms. And of course, as you get move forward through the early part of the 20th century, the numbers of farm families begin to decrease quite dramatically until we only have about 1% of the population that actually lives on farms today. So part of it is part of that phenomenon, general phenomenon. Part of it may be part of the Great Migration kind of phenomenon where people are looking to escape to better lives, and to be in centers where there are other people like themselves with whom they share a rich Black culture and organizations. And so I think it's one of those areas where I was only able to sketch something out. I hope someone else will have the resources and the interest to maybe unpack that a little further.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that very honest answer. You've really traced a continuum in terms of the resistance, forms of resistance and organizing that people engaged in the mid 19th century, leading right up until the days of the National Unity Association and Hugh Burnett and everyone involved in those efforts. Can you tell us just a little bit more about what you learned about the organizing and organizations that were formed by 19th century Black Dresden residents and the kinds of things that they were working on?
I tended to focus on the National Unity Association because it is actually called by the National Film Board film. It's called The Dresden Story. It's the story that I grew up not even knowing, even though I was born in 1953. This is very much within, the time frame when my parents first immigrated here in 49. I think that my focus on National Unity Association, my whole thrust was to try to put this in context. And it was one of the great surprises to me of how far ahead of the curve the group was in Dresden, and how they, I'm sorry, I think the courage of that group, and the courage of those that supported their actions, but also how much more profound that is when you look at where Canadian laws were at that time. And the idea that even after that time period, people were still using the law to reinforce segregation. It's a painful chapter in Dresden's history. It's had long-standing effects on people, I think. And I try to be very respectful in talking about this area of the history and sensitive because I know people who are on the wrong side of history on this one as well. And it's my hometown. So I do acknowledge a little bit of having to really struggle to tell the story well.
Definitely a balancing act. It looks as though Rosalind might have another question for us.
Oh gosh. How do I?
Okay.
Okay. No, I didn't have another question. I see myself on here twice, one with my video showing and one without. I don't know how to use this particular technology, but I do have another question though. In your book, are you telling about different people who own land and
Yes.
in Dresden and on and
Yes. I give a number of examples. It would be impossible to include everyone, of course. And when we were doing the mapping exercise, that's kind of the base for this whole exercise. We started out just trying to determine where the Don settlement actually lay because it didn't match with what the description said. And so we mapped every Black landowner that we could identify. And and there are still names on the land records that I still don't know. I'm sure we will continue to discover more. But I did pick a few examples like John Myers, who was really an amazing farmer. He was I haven't been able to establish if he was a freeman before coming here. I know there are those who will know this information. But Mr. Myers was one of the leading farmers, Black or white. There was only one white farmer who outproduced him at the time he established his 200-acre farm, just practically next door to the British American Institute. He lived right next door to Henson's property. Of course, there's others as well. There's a little in about the Bradley family. Not a great deal, because Brian's book has been so excellent on that. Brian Prince's Shadow on the Household.
Yeah.
That we'll leave that as Brian's very well told story.
That's Brian's book.
And yes, and so the Bradleys come into it, Myers, and trying to think of, like, Davises, of course. A lot of these individuals were landowners as well as being ministers. And so, yeah, I hope people find different families in there of interest to their local genealogy work.
And yeah, Tisdale Taylor was a free Black who came from Pennsylvania. And I haven't done much research on his land ownership, but I know he did own land. That's another one of my ancestors.
Yeah.
But I've researched many of the Bradleys who came to Michigan from Detroit all the way up to Marquette, and they always went back.
Yeah, the journeys are amazing. When you're talking about surprises, this is a great area of surprise, is how mobile people were, and that they're traveling across oceans, across continents, and we have families that are traced in the book from Haiti to Washington, D.C. to Dawn, and then other families who went from here to Haiti to San Francisco to Victoria. And you think of this in a time of cholera, in a time of the kinds of transportations that were available, the racism that existed that prevented people from traveling in ease on the transportation systems. Remarkable accomplishments everywhere that you look in this history.
Very true. Very true. Thank you. You're inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
I've got to start writing.
Yes, please write your story. It's so important.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to Marie Carter, our guest today. What a wonderful presentation. I do encourage everyone to take a look at this book. It's very fascinating and full of details. We have done a great disservice to so many of our Black communities in our storytelling, because we have a tendency to focus on the great recognizable figures, the famous people, the ones who appear on the postage stamps and so on, and not to look into, as you've said, the diversity and the complexity of these communities and the great many people working together in abolitionist networks, Underground Railroad networks, and other ways of organizing and resisting communally. So this is a really great attempt to take a look at that more complicated and fascinating history. Thank you so much for joining us. We're always happy to have people join us for our virtual Black History series. You can go to the museum's YouTube channel if you have missed any previous sessions, and this will also be a recording that's shared with our subscribers. And we certainly encourage you to stay tuned for all of the exciting events and activities that are happening as part of the Amherstburg Freedom Museum's 50th anniversary year throughout 2025. You can find that at amherstburgfreedom.org or on our social media channels. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.